Welcome to the MIM Podcast. I'm Adam Norman, founder and CEO at MIM, where we're on a mission to create the best major incident managers in the world. At MIM, our clients range from the largest, most well-known companies through to new, innovative companies across almost every industry from more than 72 different countries. You're going to hear about the best practices, strategies and tactics, how companies deliver major incident management excellence, some of the challenges they face, and different views on major incident management from around the world, as well as how major incident management is constantly evolving. On this podcast, we go deeper, interviewing professionals from the community. Our hope is that you will leave this podcast with some new ideas and a greater passion for major incident performance. In this episode, I speak with Andrew Jelley, Head of Major Incident and Change Management at O2 Telefonica. We talk about major incident management in telco, authentic leadership and communication, hiring major incident managers, and retaining talent. We hope you enjoy the show. Andrew, hello, how are you doing?
Yeah, hi Adam, I'm good, thank you. Yes, how are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. So obviously we've spoken, you spoke at the MIM Expo 2020. I mentioned before this, actually really well received, some really good feedback. People really enjoyed your talk. So thank you very much for that. But for people who don't know you, do you want to give a brief introduction to yourself, your role, the company?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yes, Andrew Jelley. I head up major incident management and change management at O2. I've been at O2 for about 20 months now, so not a significant period of time. I've been in the telecoms industry all of my life. I left school and joined BT as a technical apprentice a long time ago now. And I've worked for BT. I stayed at BT for 10 years. I've worked at Mercury Communications, Energist Communications, a small startup company in London, a little bit of experience in mainland Europe for a couple of years. And then I spent 15 years at Vodafone before joining O2. So my entire career is in telecoms, and most of that time is also in the kind of operational environment. So technical roles, but then more into leadership and management roles, but more or less all in the operational environment. So whether that be, major incident management currently, but, technical operational roles or managing support teams of some kind.
Okay, so I've got some interesting questions about the companies you've been at and the major incident functions there. But before we get into that, just because you touched upon it then, how did you find the transition from being more operational to moving into those management roles?
Initially, I think quite difficult, but it was a long time ago now. So I think it becomes more natural and easier as you change roles. If you're in that kind of general kind of, if you're a manager of things, you're more easily moved to be a manager of something else. I found it difficult initially moving out of technical positions into management positions. And I think part of that is just the experience of being able to do things technically and then not really needing to, or maybe not meaning to, and not becoming part of your role. But I think once you become a manager or a team leader or a leader of teams of any kind, then you kind of lose your technical hands-on capability anyway. So it becomes easier by the nature of you just can't do the technical stuff so much anymore. So I think it's problematic in the early days, but less so going forwards. And I think it's a real art sometimes to not to micromanage and not to dive into things and let the right people do the right things. And that's very difficult. From a major incident perspective, I think that is probably the most difficult thing. You've got to, in my opinion, drive a major incident process while allowing the technical teams to fix the issue. Quite a lot of my team have got technical backgrounds, but they're driving the process and they're letting the technical team fix things, and that's quite hard, particularly when you have a big messy major incident and you're getting senior pressure. It's about managing the process and demonstrating that you're managing the process and letting the technical people fix the issue as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I always think that the transition for people from either technical or operational roles into leadership and management roles is very similar to that of people who go into major incident management, in that if you're a quick study, there's a scale you get from managing teams and people and resources in the same way there is running major incidents, that you can't get no matter how good you are if you're doing the do, as it were, the technical stuff. And I think people can get quite addicted to that, because you can make a lot happen very, very quickly. And I think it's a pretty good trade-off. Doesn't suit everyone, but yeah, there's something very addictive about being able to get a lot more done and have a much bigger impact, I think, from moving to those management roles. But okay, interesting. So O2 Telefonica, obviously everyone will know the company. Also, you mentioned you've been at Vodafone before. So what's the setup at O2 Telefonica? What's for the major incident team?
So the major incident team is a 24/7 function at Telefonica, Telefonica UK. The major incident team is about 20 people, just around about 20 people. And it's really broken up into three distinct parts. One is a 24/7 shift rota, so the guys largely performing the reactive role on more or less all of our major incidents across O2. There's a separate function that looks after our enterprise customer base, so major incidents for our enterprise customers. And then there's a separate team and this was something I spoke about in the expo, that focus on improvement type activity. So I consider them to be the continuity team, if you like. They're there 5 days a week, normal business hours, whereas the other two teams, one of them is 24/7 shift pattern, and then the other one that supports our enterprise customer is, again, a shift pattern with extended hours, not 24/7, but extended hours. So yeah, three distinct parts to the team. And then service, we sit within a function called service management, or service operations, actually. Service operations and delivery is part of a directorate then called service management, and an overall operations team. So we're part of, at director level, we're part of an overall technical function, if you like. We sit within the operations directorate that's the same. It includes our networks team and our IT teams, amongst others. So it's part of a technical function.
Okay, interesting. So you said about 20 in that initial team. Where do they typically come from? Do you typically hire internally and develop people? Do you typically look externally?
It's a mix of both, actually. So we've got some guys in the team that have been there for a long, long time. Obviously, O2 is, there's a BT history to O2 in terms of ownership and where O2 was originally created from. So there's actually guys in the team that have just about 40 years service with the company. Obviously not with O2, but predating and back into BT. So there's some long-standing people in the team that have been with the company in various different roles for a long time. Many of them in technical roles previously, as I mentioned earlier. But we also have some new starters. Actually, we have a couple of new starters in the team in the last one in the last 6 months or so, and one about a year ago, that have come from external roles. So it's a mix. It's probably more people that have been there for quite some time, but the new guys bring fresh experience from different industries. Actually, we've got a new guy in the team that's joined us from the financial sector, kind of trading sector. Which, but I think if you run a strong major incident management process, as I mentioned earlier, it's about managing the process. It's about the things for me that are important about a major incident management process are things like prioritising the incident in the shoes of the customer or the impacted person or people, making sure that your communications are strong, because that's the crux of it. It kind of feels, certainly internally at O2, once the major incident management team are involved and driving an incident, that alone takes some of the pressure away. Not all of the pressure, but once it's with the major incident management team, is it prioritised correctly? Are the comms strong and representing the issue as best we understand it? And are we driving it to the quickest possible resolution? And I think if you're driving a major incident management process in that way, you can drive it in the same way in other industries, but the pressures are probably different. In O2, obviously we've got 34 million plus customer connections. Not every major incident directly affects our customers. Some are internal, some have an indirect impact to our customers. Whereas in other industries, I mentioned the guy that's joined the team from the financial sector, the pressures will be different. Could be a different customer, clearly a different customer base, but probably in that kind of environment, it's a very financial impact, second by second, minute by minute type of pressure. So, to your question, it's a mix. It's kind of internal and external people, but most of the guys. And when I joined, actually, I joined, as I say, about 20 months ago now. I was blown away by you never know, do you, when you're joining a company, what you're going to find. But I was really impressed by the strength in depth of the team, in terms of, in all respects, actually, the maturity of the process that existed, the skills and experience within the team, and the longevity of the team. The amount of time that the guys have been there.
I think it's interesting. I think it's such an interesting role that I think you do find some people just really enjoy it, and you can see why they want to stay in that role. And I think there's definitely a certain buzz that people get about it, and the role feels very purposeful. So I think getting up each day, dealing with this, knowing that you're making a difference in what you do in a very direct way is really rewarding for some people. So you can absolutely see. Others, I think it's a really useful who perhaps value other things and various different types of progression. You see them come through and maybe do a few years or a little bit longer, but they seem to enjoy it in different ways. There definitely does seem to be two schools of people, those who just want to do it forever and those who really still enjoy it but want to do it for a finite period of time. I think anything that sits outside of that, people probably aren't suited. It's quite a specific role, and there's obviously those who do it and decide it's not quite for them. But it's nice. I think you see that in mature companies. There's always a really good balance of long-standing skill sets. People have been doing this for a very long time, and know the company and the commercials really well and the customers really well. But they'll also get a nice balance of bringing in fresh perspectives to make sure we're not victims of our own success. So that's really nice. I mean, obviously, so I know the company through a couple of ways, and obviously I'm very involved in the community. But one thing I can say is, even before it was when Andrew Skinner was there, even before I was speaking to him there, anecdotally, it had a very good reputation in the community, both from people who had worked there before and also people who just knew of the function or knew of people there. It has a very good reputation. So I'm not surprised that obviously when you went in, there was a really good team and a mature process. You mentioned really good comms updates and communications with clients and good handle on it. Kind of segues nice into what sorts of tools are you using there? What's the major incident tool stack look like over there? How are you leveraging the technology?
Yeah, the main tool that we use for our communications is, well, I'm not saying the main tool, the tool that we use for our communications is X Matters. So we use X Matters as a communications mechanism. And that's the key tool, that's the one tool that we rely upon. We don't do any of and again, incident management teams are structured differently. We don't do any of the monitoring or anything of that nature. We're there to drive the process to run the major incidents. So, we rely on two tools, one being X Matters for our communications. I'll come back to that, and Remedy from a trouble ticketing and workflow perspective. X Matters we use for all of our major incident communications. We've built up a lot of capability actually within the team in terms of how to best utilise X Matters and how to fully exploit the capability that exists within the tool. We communicate all of our major incidents through many, many different channels, actually. So we do communicate some of our major incidents externally to our corporate customers. But most of our comms are internal to all of the right people that need to know about a major incident. Typically a lot of the teams that are then facing off into the customer environments, they need to be armed with the right information. But we've built a lot of capability in terms of how people can consume the content of the communications. Firstly, so we push our communications, although X Matters is the kind of native tool that we use to communicate. The consumption of that communication, it can be done in many, many different ways. Email, text messages, an app on the phone. We push it into our workplace environment internally. We push it into workplace chat. We push it into Microsoft Teams, so that anybody that wants to consume the comms can do so however they want to. So I think that the means of getting the comms out there is important, and X Matters enables us to do that. We structure. We have a lot of our comms kind of templated, such that you're not having to write everything from scratch from minute number one, which is not something you want to be doing when a major incident's happening. You want some comms that are in the main written and ready to go. So we have a lot of our comms already structured. And then with, obviously you have to add the specifics of a particular incident at a particular point in time, depending on what the impact is. And one of the things we really strive to do, and we're going to put a lot more focus on this next year, is around how do we, and I think we've moved a long way in this respect over the last 12 months or so, but how do we really put ourselves in the shoes of the customers, or not just the customers, but the impacted party when there's a major incident, or the impacted parties when there's a major incident. How do you put yourself in the shoes of the CFO if it's a financial impact? How do you put yourself in the shoes of the business customer if it's a business impact? How do you put yourselves in the shoes of many, many consumer customers if it's a consumer customer impact, such that the comms are meaningful to that customer? Because that's the kind of thing that gives the customer, and I keep using the term customer, but the stakeholders or the impacted party, the confidence that we know what's going on. We understand it, we're dealing with it, rather than it being particularly. I mean, I've already mentioned, I've got a technical background. Many members of my team have got a technical background. It's easy to focus on what's broken. Something physically has broken. And all environments, telco's the one that I can talk about because I know it, but the networks, the infrastructure, the IT systems are all becoming so much more resilient and tolerant of failure that you can see failures that don't impact customers or have a marginal impact on customers. So it's how do you really put yourself in the shoes of the customer and write the comms in a very specific way to the customer. And secondly, the timeliness of the comms, how quickly you get that first comm is important, because that's kind of what says we know we've got a problem, we're dealing with it. And that for me is probably the most difficult one. We're very consistent in our subsequent communications from a major incident perspective. We still need to do more to get that first comm out on a very timely basis. Now, that's very easy to say. It's sometimes really quite hard to do, depending on the nature of the impact. Some failures are straightforward. Immediately what it is, and you can communicate it very clearly, very concisely. Sometimes, and it tends to be the things where you have kind of mass environments. If anything impacts our call centres, for example, that's sometimes difficult to get a handle on what the real impact is. We have call centres offshore, we have call centres in the UK with thousands of people in them. When there's an impact, trying to really understand which ones are impacted, which users are impacted, what percentage of the base is impacted, that can be really quite difficult. But it's really important, firstly, to, as I've already mentioned, make the stakeholders understand that what's going on. But secondly, it's that initial lead of investigation as well. You need to know what the context is of the issue before you can. It's like finding the haystack. You've got to find the haystack before you can find the needle.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think what you see on those occasions where it is difficult to get a handle and comms perhaps don't go out as quickly as you would like, particularly to impacted groups, you see slightly further down the line loads of behaviours by different groups of stakeholders that then actually make it much more difficult to be effective as a major incident team. So whether it's internally, whether it's your own service delivery managers who then feel less comfortable that you have a handle on it, and they start trying to get involved in technical resolution, perhaps interfering with some of the technical staff or pulling them away from bridge calls, whether it's end users flooding your local service desks because you haven't directed their behaviour. Even right from the top, the leadership suddenly is very uncomfortable because they're worried about brand exposure on the global stage and in the media. So they naturally do what you would do if you're in that situation. You try and make sure there's a handle on it, but it actually then pulls us away from the core process that we know. So I always think that's a really interesting one that you see. It can be as simple as not getting those initial comms out in the first 15 minutes, but you see all these behaviours that happen further on, even if you have now got a handle, typically in what we call post 15 minutes, so the big chunk where you're looking at identifying workarounds or further diagnostics. You see loads of behaviours kind of manifest there that actually then make it much harder to be as effective as you could be otherwise. So I completely agree. I think it's a really interesting thing we always talk about. And the funny thing is, you often get people, even experienced major incident managers, who, for the right reasons, hold off on issuing comms, let's say because they want more information and they want the comms to actually be meaningful. They're doing it with the exact intent you would want them to have, but it has the exact opposite effect of what you would hope from the key groups of stakeholders. So I feel that the challenge there and the dichotomy of wanting speed and accuracy, but also the need for some relevant information. I think that's a forever challenge. The other thing that's interesting, I think, is how you build a culture, because as you say, all companies, particularly of your level of maturity, where you've really got this down to a fine art and you're trying to shave seconds off performance like a race car, essentially. I think the one thing that companies, when they get to that stage, struggle with is the structure of not the templates, but obviously the actual comms that are issued, because we all write differently, particularly if you have teams in different locations, and even the cultural nuances of teams who perhaps are located in different areas, and depending on which customer you're talking. How do you really get those so it also still feels consistent, like everything else in the process? And that's definitely an interesting one to try and tackle.
As I sort of already said, we template our comms as far as we can, but there's always, every update is handwritten by an individual. And as you say, every individual writes things in different ways, and we all read things and consume things in different ways. Something that we do every day, actually, we have a team meeting at 10 o'clock every day, assuming there's been a major incident in the last 24 hours. And one of the things we talk about on that call is the comms. So we talk about a number of things. Prioritisation of the incident. Did we get the priority right? Because that's not always easy, particularly if you can't define a clear impact statement. How do you prioritise it? So we talk about the priority of an incident, and we talk about the communications. They're two of the key things that we talk about on our 10 o'clock team call. And it's all about trying to drive towards consistency in the way that you've just mentioned. If we put an incident out at the wrong priority, I think we're in a good position, actually, where if we do revise a priority post closure, we tend to downgrade it rather than upgrade. So I think we're doing it, what I think is the right way around. We're overdoing it and then downgrading rather than upgrading after the event. And as I say, the other thing that we focus on is the comms, and is there anything that we can do to improve the comms? And there's some quite, several times that meeting will be cancelled quite regularly if we haven't had a major incident. But there'll be discussions in that meeting that will drive towards things like, we'll change the template, change the pre-written comms. They're not quite right. It didn't sound quite right. It didn't come across appropriately. So we change it. And that's a very informal, half an hour call at 10 o'clock every day that, as I say, gets cancelled if there hasn't been a major incident. But it's real time. It's more or less real. It's soon after the event, so you're talking about something as a team soon after the event, and you're making changes there and then to make sure that gets handled better next time. And it's added a lot of value, actually. That team call, that 10 o'clock team call.
It's really interesting because I think that gets to the root of the different styles of communication really, really quickly. You see them in this environment, quite a mature team who individually on their own would be fine. They'd get loads of speed on issuing comms and they'd all be very good. But there's a fundamental difference in the way they interpret information, the way they interpret the world, and how they deliver information. And I think what's even more fascinating is that's exact same thing that you have in your groups of stakeholders. You tend to find, in our experience and the research of doing a lot of psychometric profiling now, that senior stakeholders, particularly if you're talking about like CFOs that you mentioned earlier, or even like the UK CEO, you find CFOs are more likely to sit in the S&C quadrants for like highly analytical, wanting loads and loads of information before making decisions. And you tend to find CEOs and people who we would class as natural leaders sit more in the D and the I, so normally have a deep engagement with people, but they like bullet points in terms of information and they want action speed very, very quickly. And so it's really interesting when you see these groups, when you're doing the training, of a room full of very experienced people all disagreeing on about the comms they're going to issue and losing a lot of time because of it. But you can absolutely see that in the personalities working. So it's really interesting when we do that training, when people, particularly skilled people, have this moment of eureka moment of understanding of, that's why I have this particular challenge with so-and-so service director. I think I'm giving them all the information as they should need it. They think I'm doing that because I'm not confident in what I'm saying, so therefore I can't make it more concise. And it's just a fundamental difference in personality styles and information delivery, which is really interesting. I think you mentioned X Matters. I think you're going to see the tool providers, so PagerDuty were obviously a sponsor of the expo. Exigence were. There's lots of other companies out there like AlertOps, like Everbridge, loads of companies out there. I think you'll see a lot of them start to take more and more notice of the personality types and figure out how they appease that. I know within a lot of the tools, it's very easy now to send multiple types of communications to different groups of stakeholders, essentially in one issue, which I think is a really good move forward. It's existed for a while now, but I think that's very good. I think it's more the major incident team documenting groups of stakeholders and the majority of personality types in there, which is perhaps going to help drive that. It's something we do with customers at the moment. So essentially have a list of the people in there, like, well, okay, 90% of the people in our C-suite sit within D&I. That means bullet point information, less information. So I think it's a really interesting way of flipping how you think about an issue, the comms. So please tell me a bit about the difference between Vodafone and your experience there, if you can, and your move to Telefonica. Because Vodafone, again, big, very well known telco, have reasonably sized major incident functions, so they dedicate resources and bodies to it. Was there a big difference? Was there much of a change for you?
I wasn't managing the major incident management team at Vodafone, so it's slightly difficult for me to comment on that part of it specifically. I think, firstly, I feel very lucky to have worked for, two such great companies, big brands, great companies. So I feel very fortunate in that respect. I think something to bear in mind, if you think about the mobile telecoms industry, dependent on how far back you go and where you say it started, it's quite young. As an industry, mobile telecoms is quite young. If you look at BT and the fact that they were the post office beforehand, they were decades old and are more decades old now. The mobile industry really only goes back to the mid-80s is where I think the mobile industry started, really. So, it's not old. So I think what exists. And again, industries are all different, but I think what I sense is different levels of process maturity across some of the mobile operators. What I find at O2 is that it's a very, and I kind of had this perception of O2 before I joined, and it became a reality when I joined, that it's very mature in its process set up. And I'm not just talking major incident. I'm talking, the processes generally, across all of the ITIL framework, but processes generally are structured and are adhered to. I think, in other parts of the telco industry, I see less structure in that respect. I think it's a bit more tactical in terms of how some companies operate. And I'm not saying one's right and one's wrong. I actually think to a degree somewhere in the middle of those two is the right thing to do. You can be too mature and too stuck to a process that means you don't develop for the future. You don't enhance it. But then if you're too tactical, all you're doing is you're just changing things every day and, acting, a bit of a knee-jerk kind of environment. But yeah, as I say, I think I can't really comment on the Vodafone major incident management side of things because I wasn't particularly close to it. I think largely most of the big telcos, the mobile telcos, are very similar in terms of how they operate a lot of their processes. And I think a lot of the major incidents that the telcos experience are very similar. They're all using very similar networks, quite similar vendor footprints, quite similar IT infrastructure. Certainly, if you think about, the big ones, the big mobile operators in the UK, they are at that age where they're going through lots of refresh. I've said there, I always think the mid-'80s is when the mobile industry kind of started.
So it's funny, you mentioned that. So I'm 84, so I'm 36. So 84, I can remember, so it obviously would have been the 90s, so I probably, 11, 12. The first mobile phone we had in our household, and I can remember going out, it was a Nokia, the same one that everyone used to play snakes on. And I remember that very quickly, almost overnight, becoming a thing where you would see young teenagers, suddenly parents want to keep in touch with them, and there was this whole quite huge movement. So yeah, I mean that really resonates around that time period. I missed out on the giant phones that people have. They're absolutely huge.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm a bit older than you, but I can remember a bit further back. But not further back in the mobile industry, but back further in telecoms generally. But I think all of the networks are at a stage where they're going through so much change in terms of the infrastructure, the technology. I'm sure there are industries that I didn't really set out to get into telecoms. It just happened for me through a conversation with careers officer at school. But when I think about it, I'm interested in technical things, and it's an industry. I'm sure it's the same in a lot of industries, but it just leaps forward every year. Every year there's something significantly different, and that drives a lot of change within the industry from a technical perspective. But also, if you think about the reliance on mobile, it's just increased massively, and that's self-evident, as you say. Back in the 80s, it was a new fad, and everybody wanted a phone just because it was a new fad, and drop calls were regular, and you just put up with it. But if you look at the reliance now, it's significant and intensified over the course of this year as we've lived through COVID. Communications have been, arguably the number one thing for all different reasons. For loved ones, probably some pretty terrible loved ones conversations at some points in time, and keeping industry running and everybody working from home. So yeah, the level of reliance, and even irrespective of COVID, as we move into 5G, and that opens up use cases around, driverless cars and remote surgery and all those kinds of things. It's just it's a magnitude so much greater than it was, 10 years ago, let alone, thinking back to the beginning of mobile telecoms in the 80s.
I don't think it is the same in all industries. I think disruption's a bit of a buzzword, but actually I think there has been a lot of change in other industries, but actually a lot of that stemmed from communications and the way we work and the way we do things. So I would suggest perhaps actually telco in particular as an industry has probably been a major driver and a key factor in everything else evolving. But yeah, I mean, you think about now that it blows my mind that you're able to keep in touch with family members. So me and my wife, we have, particularly on her side, has family all over the place in Australia and America. So it's really quite special to be able to do things like FaceTime with people now. And if you've got elderly relatives who obviously need additional care, the idea that if you're further away from them, that they still get to see the whole family, and it's really quite special and quite spectacular what's been achieved and just how much of a role that plays in all of our daily experience now. I mean, I hate to think, I'm sure there's some interesting research on how much we all look at our phones and how many times we look at the screen nowadays. But if you look at the positive impacts it's had, it's been pretty special. I think it's interesting you mentioned about there being a nice balance somewhere in between that kind of strategic vision and the tactical execution, particularly in maturity. I think banking is a really interesting example for me of getting to a really good level of major incident management, but then assuming that you are at the pinnacle and almost pausing progress. So almost universally, we're very privileged to get to work and support a lot of these companies, but almost universally, that's what's happened. They've got to a really, really good standard and then just stopped evolving and perhaps stopped trying to, because they got to such good standard. And I think we can all be guilty as well of, because there's a really powerful brand, we work for a really interesting, quite dynamic company with a very good reputation. It's easy, particularly in banking, to fall into that trap. I think of, we are whatever company it may be, and we do very well. We're a very successful company. We've got this huge global footprint. We're really good at this. And then perhaps to pause on that driving for innovation, keep trying to improve. You don't see it as much in other places, but banking's a really interesting one for me because they always get to a really good level, particularly well-known names, and it just seems to then tailor off after a couple of years, and they almost lose pace with lots of other industries doing this. And I don't see as much of that in telco. I think telco is pretty good at keeping up with pace, and there's less resting perhaps on previous performance. It's just not something you see as much in telco. There seems to be more drive for constant improvement. And perhaps that is partly because of the culture you guys are in, where you are constantly innovating and communications is a big driver for everything else.
Yes, quite probably. I don't know the banking industry, but certainly telecoms is, as you say, constantly innovating. And, to use your analogy of keeping in touch with friends and family all around the world, in Australia, for example, that's very personal to you and that's very specific to you. And the mobile network supports that kind of thing that is always important. And it's become an expectation that, connectivity will be good. But if you think about COVID and keeping in touch with loved ones, that is, that's just added a whole nother level to some, we're always striving to give the best possible service. But when you've really got loved ones and critical conversations that people are so dependent on a mobile device for, that's one aspect of it from a consumer perspective. But you've also got the big multinational corporate customers that are also, and everything else that goes around the mobile network that are so dependent on the mobile network and the service. And that just feels like it just intensifies, when there is a major incident, it intensifies the need to get it fixed as quickly as possible and communicate it really clearly, but communicate it really clearly in respect of all of the impacts that it can have. You as a consumer customer that wants to get in touch with a loved one in Australia versus, a multinational company that may not be able to operate their business or certainly not as efficiently as they should and could because they're dependent on, mobile services so much more so than they've ever been.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? The world's definitely getting more competitive too. So, in a business terms, what can seem like a fairly minor thing, like a couple of hours outage at a solicitor's firm, for example, is probably costing them significant business, because in their industry, like, people do want immediate responses. If you're a top law firm and we pay you very large amounts of money for a retainer, I want to be able to pick up the phone when I'm in Japan at 2 a.m. and know that I can get a partner on the phone for what is a pretty big looming issue around trademark IP or whatever it may be. So yeah, it's really interesting. I find it's one of the things that's always fascinated me about what we do, is going the 5 steps into the commercial of what this really means for that particular company. And when you have that, I find that a really interesting, quite a fun game to play, particularly when you expand right out into like reputational damage and what does this mean in the mind of a consumer, and also brands. So we do this section within the global best practice that talks about car manufacturers and the psychology of buyers for certain brands. So if there were technology issues that ended up with, or even defects that aren't necessarily sat within IT, product defects, that means you can't get your, let's say it's a company car, your BMW or Mercedes, whatever it may be, those buyers may, and I'm not saying they will, but may look at a substitute brand. The person who looked at, I don't know, 5 Series, 6 Series BMW may have been comfortable going, well, okay, if it's going to be another 6 months, I'd move to a Mercedes. Whereas I personally believe the person who would look at a Volvo, let's say the big 4x4, the XC90, they often choose that for very different reasons than the people who choose the BMW or Mercedes. So those buyers in that same scenario, I believe, would be more likely to wait for that particular car and brand than to, I think they see it as an intelligent buy that is less emotional than somebody who taps into the emotion of the, and I mean, that's always up for debate as well, but I find that stuff where you get into all the way to the psychology of buyer and individual brands that you support and how you think they'll behave as a result, really fascinating. But I digress. So obviously you're in a really interesting position. I'd love to know a bit more about what you think makes a good major incident manager. So when I appreciate you have team managers who do various hiring for you as well, but when you specifically look at the makeup of your team and the people you're looking to bring into it, and what qualities you think really are embodied by a good major incident manager, what do you think they are, some of the key ones?
I think some of the key ones are a collaborative approach to working. So, for me, we have a major incident management team in O2, as you well know, and we've spoken about. But it's, for me, major incident management is a process. And to be successful as a process, you don't just need a strong team. You need everybody that plays a role in that major incident management process being able to collaborate. And I think that starts with the major incident manager. I think one of the things that, you mentioned earlier about whether it's a rewarding role or not, I think the nature of the people that undertake that role are the people that like to fix things. They're kind of troubleshooters and enjoy fixing things. So I think it's a collaborative approach. I think it's people that enjoy the buzz of, working as a virtual team to get things resolved. I think it's people that don't necessarily need the kind of proverbial pat on the back, as strange as that may sound. Major incident management can sometimes be a bit of a thankless task. You resolve a major incident and that's what you're expected to do. So there's rarely the proverbial pat on the back. There's sometimes challenging questions for those ones that don't go well. So it can be a bit of a thankless task. I think, and we've already spoken about communications, and everybody receives everybody writes communications in their own way and communicates in their own way, and everybody consumes communications in a different way. So I don't think there's a single right answer to communications. It's interesting you were talking about earlier in terms of some of the tool vendors starting to think about how they'll structure comms in such a way that it can be sent to different kind of types of people in different ways, but clearly strong communicators, written and verbally, people that can kind of take command and control of a difficult situation. You know, some of major incidents by their nature come in all shapes and sizes, and sometimes you get one and you kind of think this will be straightforward. You know, this will be fixed in half an hour, and it's not a difficult situation. On the other hand, you can have some really difficult ones that you just think, I can't see a way forward with this, and you know, you get a lot of senior people showing an interest, and you need a major incident manager that can demonstrate a level of authority and command and control of a virtual team of people, with a view to driving it forward to the quickest possible resolution. And I think, you know, we've certainly got a strong team in that respect at O2. You know, those guys, particularly out of hours, you know, they're working 24/7. In my view, they're effectively acting as proxy for our most senior people, right up to director level. You know, they're guys that are going to be making some calls. And when I say calls, I don't mean phone call, I mean judgment calls about, you know, are we going to press the big red button and get 50 people out of bed right now in the middle of the night because we've got a major issue going on? You know, they're making those kind of judgment calls. So I think, I guess to summarize, you know, people that can work collaboratively, I think that's number one. People that people are going to want to work for as part of a virtual team, if that makes sense. Good communicators, and a level of kind of command and control and authority such that they can command a virtual team, which can be difficult. You know, we often have, you know, we could have 20. It's not unheard of to have 20, 30 people on a conference call trying to resolve a major incident. You know, from multiple teams internally and multiple vendors from you know, our partners and our vendors. That's a tough thing to do. You know, to drive that virtual team of people to one goal, which is to resolve that incident as quickly as possible. And then I guess the final thing, and I'm, you know, thinking as we're talking, but I think the final thing for me is, and you touched on it earlier when you were talking about the banking industry, but people that want to kind of improve for the future and step things forward. You know, we talked about technology driving change in the telecoms environment. You know, things never stand still, and therefore you've got to adapt for the future. But I also think even if things are standing still, I'm a firm believer that you can always make things a bit better. You know, if you're a football fan, you know, whoever won the Premier League, we know who won the Premier League last year, whoever wins it this year, they're not going to sit on their laurels and just say, well, we won the Premier League this year, we'll probably win it again next year. Because if you take that approach, you probably won't. You know, you've got to think about those incremental gains and how do you make things better. And I'm not talking about revolutionary type changes, but, you know, incremental gains, small gains.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. And obviously we because you've done the whole talk around your move to having this proactive team. We won't go into it too much here because people can already consume that at the expo. But I said to you again before the call, I think perhaps because you're close to it, it just seemed like the logical thing. And I know you had some data you mentioned that backed up what you believed, but I still think that was a very visionary move for you to make, and to move some of those ops teams to focusing on that continual improvement and how are they driving the things that are going to change the numbers and reduce major incident volumes. And obviously there's a really significant cost. You mentioned 20 people coming out. There is a cost to all of those operational resources being engaged that's not insignificant. And so I think that was a really smart move that you made, actually. It made for such an enjoyable talk to listen to and to watch. And I thought it was a real testimony to your leadership and vision to have done that and to made that change. It's really interesting. But so it's funny, you mentioned about it being perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of running major incidents is having these 20 people, 50 people, whatever it may be, different personalities, all trying to contribute You've got various interesting social hierarchies that form, even, particularly with technical people. It's normally around their competence. So a lot of their self-esteem is derived from their effort and how hard they work and how good they are at their job, which is a very good place for that to come from. But it means there's interesting dynamics that you're always dealing with when you're trying to lead this group of diverse people. And that's another part is interesting. I think as an industry, we just completely missed that for years. All of it was around, here's the process, get the process as good as possible, here's some useful tools. And then the people who had innate leadership skills, who were naturally good with people and could navigate, kind of did well and flourished in the role and stayed doing it. And those who perhaps struggled a bit more. One of the things I really wanted to do when we first created the Global Best Practice in IT Major Incident Management was to codify all of these leadership skills that in part existed elsewhere, some of them, maybe in different contexts, but actually give people this mental tool belt of every, let's call it soft skill scenario that you're going to encounter as a major incident leader. There is going to be a model and various options that sit around that so that you have a deeper understanding. And some of these people did this naturally, innately, but it meant that there was a really good way as well for your very best major incident managers to explain in a frameworked way and a common language to anyone who you were trying to perhaps move up to their level and get them to that point. And also new people entering the team. It's like, well, okay, anytime there's conflict, not necessarily between the major incident manager, but two of the technical resolving groups, for example, you can't afford to lose. Let's say you've got 10 people there. One of them closes up because of this. Well, you've just lost 10% of your brain power, or if both do, you've just lost 20%. And that's not insignificant. And so being able to understand things like the 5 styles of conflict management, what are my options here? What's the best option? Which one offers speed? Which one is there a trade-off? Which one is going to mean that these relationships are maintained not for this one major incident, but for the next 10, 20, 100 major incidents? And so it was that was the exact reason, I think, and also partly why we've done so well as a company and been so privileged to serve so many people so quickly, is because that was almost the missing piece, even for very good teams. It was, how do we have this framework, a bit like ITIL does for service management, but how do we have this in the context of major incident management? The process is there. We've got the methodology for continual improvement that we built as well. But I think the quickest real-time change you see is the leadership section and all of those mental models that people have. And also the fact that the team now have one operating model for every scenario they encounter. And it's been really humbling to see, but not just from the company's transformation, but perhaps more so seeing individuals, so those who are already very, very good, reaching a whole new level of excellence, and those who perhaps were somewhere in the middle, being able to get to the top much faster. And it's been really interesting to see people change in that way. I think that it'll always be the hardest aspect of it, though, for people, always, because people are messy. And there's so many variables. But so on the same theme of that, I'm not asking you to name names, but in the same theme, what would you say are some of the least desirable qualities you've seen in major incident professionals, or qualities that perhaps have not been particularly useful?
It's probably the inverse of all the things I mentioned earlier, is the easy answer. But I think the key part for me in terms of leadership of a major incident management is being, and this probably goes for leadership. In fact, my belief is this goes for leadership generally. It's about being authentic. It's about being yourself. You can't expect everybody. Back to your point, you can get everybody to a certain level across some kind of fundamental things, but ultimately, being yourself is what you need to be. And I think, if I think about my major incident management team, I can think of different people that command control of major incidents in very, very different ways. Some of them will command control of a major incident through their technical understanding, as an example. Now, I said earlier that, we're not the technical team, we're not the teams that fix things, but actually, when you think about, when you have a major incident, you have a virtual team. You have a virtual team because you have people looking after different technologies or different parts of the overall journey or experience. Sometimes the best placed person to understand that overall experience, everybody understands their little piece, their piece of technology. The person that understands it overall is quite often the major incident manager or a service manager that we might involve in a call, for example. So some people can command a call through that, for example, the technical understanding of, I know how this thing hangs together end to end. Some people can command a call just through being very collaborative, as I mentioned earlier, engendering a really collaborative working environment in a major incident. But I think the thing, back to your question around what doesn't make a good major incident manager, and if I think about, because I draw an analogy between, a major incident manager leading a major incident with leadership more generally. And I do think the one thing that is a strong point is to be authentic, be yourself. And I think if people try not to do that, if you try and command a call at a technical level, but you don't understand it technically, you're not being authentic and you're going to get found out. So I think, not being authentic would be something that you wouldn't want. I really don't think you can drive, I think you can drive everybody to a certain level of basic kind of hygiene factors, but you've got to let people be authentic. You've got to let people be themselves. You can't drive a load of clones in an organisation because some will naturally be stronger at certain things than others. So, yeah, I think not being authentic is probably the one key thing that I would say.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, I mean, in that particular role, people aren't daft. They see it, they sense it. And yeah, they absolutely feel the authenticity. Yeah, really interesting. Okay, so how at Telefonica, how are you ensuring? You mentioned you've got some great team members, good mixture of people who've been there for a long time, some new blood as well. How are you ensuring that you retain those talented individuals? Because that can also be a really key thing that people struggle with. They get it to a certain point and they start losing a lot of talented people.
We haven't had a lot of churn. I've only been there 20 months, but, we haven't had a lot of churn in the team. And I mentioned earlier, we do have some long-standing team members that have, been there for many, many, many years. So I think some of it just seems to be happening. I'll come back to what we're doing in a moment, but it feels a stable team anyway, in terms of, there isn't a high amount of attrition. And I think that's driven by a number of things, people that enjoy the role. It's a great company to work for. I can genuinely say that. I think the nature of shift working, 24/7 shift working, is also one of those things that people either love or hate. And if you're doing it, you probably like it, and therefore you're kind of stick with that shift work environment. And that's certainly been my experience with a lot of shift teams. Actually, I think in shift teams, this is a bit of a sweeping statement, but I think in shift teams generally, you do see a relatively low attrition because people like the kind of balance it gives them in relation to their personal life. So I think most of those things are the things that are kind of already happening that are making for a relatively stable team. I think the things that we're doing, or the things that I like to think that we're doing, are, we are trying to invest in the future, and we are trying to evolve the team. So it's not static, it's not stagnant, and I mentioned that earlier, and it's not about significant change, it's about incremental changes to make sure we're adapting for the future. So I think that's important, and as much as I said that there's guys in the team that have been there a long time, there's also some people in the team that are new. We have people that are quite new off of the apprenticeship program, a graduate program. We have new starters to the team from other companies, as I mentioned earlier. So I think they need to see that we're investing in the future. And when I say investing in the future, I mean that through stuff that we're doing within the team to make sure we keep evolving for the future. But also making sure that people are being trained on the new things that are coming along. We're always as all the operators are, going through lots of technology change. How do you make sure the major incident management team are aware, not at a real in-depth technical level, but aware of what these technology changes are bringing along? If you think about 5G as an example, it's fundamentally different than some of the other generations of mobile networks. The difference between 2G and 3G and 3G and 4G, there's different levels of change, and 5G is significantly different. So making sure that we're investing in the right sort of training for the major incident managers, such that they understand these new services, these new systems, these new technologies. I think that probably summarises what we're doing.
So, okay, yeah, interesting. I think my experience tells me there's a couple of factors. Company culture, which you mentioned, is really good there. Really good company for, I think, plays a huge part in it. I think more so than most people realise. Being in a good environment, people understanding the code of conduct, so what's acceptable at certain companies, what isn't, whether that's overly political environments or not, and hierarchies. I think salary comes into it. I'm not asking you directly, but I do think people who do major incident management and do it well are relatively good high performers. So I think getting a good balance of paying people well and fairly for what is or can be quite a tough job definitely has an impact. You see companies who perhaps try to pay a little less and struggling with and get everything else right do start to lose. So I do think things like salaries do come into it to an extent. Funnily enough, I think there's also a trade-off. I think the banks, particularly well-known global banks, particularly those who are putting or pointing major incident teams towards trading platforms, pay very well in the industry, some of the best payers, but they sometimes often do have a problem with retained staff because the pressures can be just through the roof, and so they can still fight. So I'm not saying salary is everything. It's an interesting balance. I think there's definitely some play in there. But okay, really interesting.
I think I won't speak about salary directly because I can't. But our major incident manager role is quite a senior role in the organisation. These are not junior positions; these are senior roles. That we recruit senior people into. If I think about, and I've seen it elsewhere where you have. And again, it depends on the model. I've seen it elsewhere where you don't necessarily have a dedicated major incident management team, or and I'm thinking about a very specific company, but there was a major incident management team, but they were really quite junior roles, and they performed the administrative aspects of the major incident process. And when a major incident happened, somebody senior from the area that was thought to be causing the impact would step in as the major incident manager. What I'm saying is, at O2, we have, our major incident managers are quite senior positions in the organisation. So we recruit accordingly. And therefore, salary comes with that level of accountability and organisational standing.
Yeah, I think also that the acknowledgement of what the role is goes a long way with people. So I think absolutely it's interesting. We've done quite a bit of work with a few clients in terms of building their competency frameworks. One of the things you find for major incident management is people were never quite sure where to put it. So all this work that a really good HR team have done with the operational leaders in building frameworks, so particularly like managed service, I have SDM1, Service Delivery Manager 2, 3, 4, Service Director, and having a very clear structure towards progression in them, so that people understood the game they're playing and it was fair. I think major incident management for a very long time in most industries never quite got that attention. And I think that was at the detriment and cost some people some really good staff because they felt like there wasn't progression. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be competencies and tiering the role. It can be just very clearly acknowledging that it's a more senior operational role and bringing people into that and treating it such. I do think that goes a really long way. So it's really interesting to hear you say that. I'm not surprised, but yeah, it does. It's interesting. There still seems to be. We work with a number of managed service providers, and predominantly the ones we work with really understand this and get it right. But we've also done some work with a few organisations. I think managed service providers have a bigger challenge because they're going to be driven a lot of the time by customers and what they want. And unfortunately, if all your customers want to drive down the price on everything, you're going to struggle then to obviously hire and pay larger salaries. We've seen this across the industry, haven't we? With obviously offshoring. India for a long time was the destination to drive down operational costs, and there are various trade-offs for that. But I think it's really interesting that you see some managed service providers now get this right and behave very much how you're talking about it. It's a more senior role, even charging for the major incident service as a completely separate service, which means you have the funds available directly for that, and it's not tied up or skewed in a completely different cost centre or different part of the business and expected. Whereas you see others perhaps still just throwing large volumes of relatively inexperienced bodies at it and wondering why that is always a problem with their contracts and can cost you contracts pretty easily. It can undermine all the great work you do everywhere else in the business. But then you've got some pretty severe major incidents and there's no, as you termed it, command and control. There's no control of the major incident. You don't feel inspired with confidence when you're there as a customer listening to it. And it's partly because you've got the wrong bodies doing the what is quite a senior role. So really interesting to hear your take on that. And a difficult one, though, for managed service providers, because if you can't, it's almost driving that behaviour back with the customer at point of sale, which means you're very much dependent on solution consultants and pre-contract discussions going, no, you need to understand what you're asking for and the implications of driving down cost in this function, versus no, we want white glove service and very good, capable people. So therefore, that's one area that we definitely will be willing to spend it. But it's always amazed me that that's a customer-driven thing, and causes that problem. But very interesting. So for you personally in your role, obviously you have quite a holistic view of this. What's your biggest frustration with owning the major incident function? What's the biggest thing that constantly challenges you?
I think it's probably something that we've already touched on around, when you get that difficult major incident, understanding the impact, because they're the ones that get the senior visibility, where it just appears that you don't have an understanding of what's going on and what the problem is. And I wouldn't say that's a regular occurrence for us. It's certainly the minority, but that for me is the most difficult part of the role. And sometimes you can, you get certain incidents, and I just feel like that's a straightforward one. We know what it will be. The comms will be out in 10 minutes and it will be fixed inside the hour. And then there's those others where you just think, oh no, not that system again, because I know we're going to struggle to understand the impact. And if you can't understand the impact, you can't articulate. It's back. I'm repeating myself. Apologies, but it's back to you don't sound like you know what you're doing because you can't articulate the impact, and you can't find the haystack. So how are you going to find the needle? So that for me is probably the one thing I find the biggest frustration, and that's hard to resolve. That is about making sure that you've got a strong post-incident process to make sure you do understand that issue better the next time round. So if it does come along again, you've got the right material, you've got the right collateral, you've got the right processes in place, you've got the right contacts in place to help you articulate that issue better next time. So I think that's probably the biggest thing. And then I think for me personally, and I mentioned it in the expo, I haven't mentioned it here yet, but I also head up change management. and the cause of major incidents can be change related, and untypical in telecoms. So what I've now got as of March this year, I took on the change management team. So if we have a major incident relating to change, then that's my problem as well. But we're making really good progress in that respect, in terms of driving down. And that was one of the reasons for that organisational change, such that we could add as much focus as possible to eradicate major incidents that result from change activity. There's a lot of change. And again, I'm talking telecoms industry, but I'm sure it's not much different in many industries. Significant amounts of change in order to, keep us moving along that technology change curve and offer new services. And when you undertake some of the types of change that we have to undertake in order to do that and to deliver new services and the best possible service, it's complex. And some of that change is massively complex. I always think about it in terms of, try and draw analogies to, if you have a problem with your broadband, what do? You restart your router. Does that router always come back online every single time that you restart it? Not always. You might need to restart it again. That's a silly but small analogy to change management. You're undertaking a change to restart your router and it hasn't come back online. Well, that was the change you expected to happen. But the level of change that we undertake is massive and is complex. So I think the two frustrations for me is change-related major incidents. But although that's a frustration, that's an opportunity and that's a challenge and that's an area that we're making good progress in. We're seeing a significant reduction on major incidents resulting from change. And then, as I say, the other one is around just being able to articulate a major incident really clearly as soon as possible. I'm not sure there's no silver bullet to that one. That's a longer piece of work, but
I think it's just that is pretty normal across every industry. I think more so with very large, complex, long-established systems that a company like yourself would have, it's naturally going to be more difficult. There's so much entangled in the systems that it's very easy for someone not to identify potential conflicts within systems and various sub-applications. And it's just so vast that it is very difficult to do. I think it's interesting. It's hard to do it retrospectively, but really having incredible CMDBs that really align to service delivered is a really good thing. And I know banks in particular are getting better at this. It's a hell of a thing to undertake if it wasn't there in the first place and try and do it retrospectively. But I know that it's a pretty major instance or a pretty good business case to do that large piece of work and to spend that significant money. But even so, I think it was the last annual report is something like 70% of major incidents across all industries were accountable. With the result of change, and that's an average. But
our numbers are nowhere near that. So that's a good sign, and they're decreasing. I agree with the CMDB thing as well, from both a major incident and a change perspective. We've just gone through a big CMDB program. I think it's more than just a CMDB. It's how do you build a service model from your CMDB such that if a particular server fails, you understand the impact of that failure, or if you're taking a particular server out of service as a piece of planned work, you understand that. So I think the base is the CMDB. The service modelling that sits on top of that is a really important piece. I think there's a massive opportunity in that respect, but it's complicated. It's beyond my level of understanding. It's complex, and then I think the other really important part in that respect is how do you keep all of that up to date? With such a context of change that's always ongoing. Your CMDB could be updated now at 12:30 on a Monday. It's out of date by 5 o'clock tonight because so much change has gone on. Unless you've got a strong process or a strong mechanism for keeping it updated.
Yeah, I think that's it, isn't it? You're right. There's several levels on from your CMDB of like exactly what services here, but it goes even more granular because you've then got things that are periodically impacted. So like payroll's an interesting one, or seasonal sales, depending on the company. There's all kinds of variables. And that's not that difficult if you're a new modern technology company with a smaller number of staff and very clear core line of business. When you're a company like yourself that just has thousands of people everywhere, many, many services, you provide lots of core products and services to lots of different cohorts of customers, it just gets exponentially complex. So yeah, very, very interesting. And as you say, when your rate of change is also just non-stop, even momentarily, that not keeping pace, suddenly the whole thing's out. And it's another huge program of work to try and resolve that. But an interesting one, I've not seen that fully resolved anywhere yet, not in kind of institutions like yourself, big companies. A difficult one, but okay, really interesting. So obviously you've talked about kind of your earlier career, so I won't go too much into that. I do two questions actually. First of all, do you have any very specific goals, both personal and professional, at the moment that you're working towards?
I've thought quite a lot about recently because I do like to think about my career and what the next steps are. But at the moment, I'm 20 months into my employment at O2, and I'm only 9 months into heading up the change management team. And personally, I'm at a really high point in my career in terms of how I feel about my career. I'm really enjoying it. I think it's a great company to work for. It's a great department within the great company, and I've got what I see as two really challenging roles that I'm enjoying. There's a lot of challenges around it, but I think we're making a difference. So at the moment, that kind of is my career plan, continue doing what I'm doing and developing in that respect. We have a joint venture on the horizon, or a potential joint venture with Virgin Media on the horizon, subject to regulatory approval, which we won't hear about for a while yet. But, a merger of two great companies like that will inevitably lead to opportunities. Don't know what those opportunities might be yet, but I just know I want to be part of it. So certainly professionally, that's kind of where I'm at personally. Loving the role in the current company. Feel like we're making a big difference across major incident management and change management. And when I say that I think about them as processes, not teams necessarily. I manage and head up the major incident and change management teams, but they're both processes that are much, much wider group of people play a role in, and the success of those processes is down to all of those people. It's not just down to me or my team. So that's kind of where I'm at professionally. Personally, I've got two teenage children, or a 12-year-old and a 14-year-old, so soon to be two teenage children. And just making sure that we raise them as to be the best that they can be, which is another challenge.
Oh yeah, so I'm nowhere. So I have a 3-year-old daughter, so nowhere near the age of yours, and it's funny the amount of time I find myself spending thinking about how do I best support her. So I'm, funnily enough. So I've owned numerous companies throughout my professional career, as well as working in corporate world. So on the outside, it probably looked like I'm very comfortable with risk. I mean, calculated risk, I'm very specific about mitigating. But when it comes to her, my problem is I'm perhaps too protective. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about actually she needs exposure and needs to build her own risk tolerance to everything, even simple things like falling in, because she's quite an energetic child. But she's also very bright from her mother's side, and thinking about how do I give her more and more exposure to the right things. And so it's I mean, I understand maybe not to the point you're at, but I think about it a lot, and it's actually quite rewarding to think about it and put a couple of things in place, and then kind of see the fruits of that. But it's definitely one of the most fun and terrifying adventures of my life. Is definitely being a parent.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it gets more fun and more terrifying.
Yeah, I can't even begin to imagine what it's like with teenagers. I've got a while yet. So, couple of quick questions then. So, any really good books you've read this year that you'd recommend to people?
That's a tough question because I'm not a massive reader. I tend to flick between kind of news. I'm not a big reader. I'm not a big reader of books. I read a lot of kind of news stories, and I'm quite into, occasionally read up on leadership things, and that's, if you think about a career, there's certain things that kind of stick with you. So I'm conscious. I'm always looking for those kind of things that stick with you. We've done some interesting kind of development, and this has been driven by my manager across his entire organisation, called the Tetra Maps. It's like a Myers-Briggs type thing. I'm fascinated by that kind of stuff. So that's what we've done in that respect this year has kind of provoked my thinking and my kind of reading around some of those subjects. And that comes back to some of the things we've touched on around, working collaboratively as an example. If you can't understand yourself and you can't understand the people that you're working with, how do you best collaborate with them? You can't. I guess my reading is probably limited to news and sports from a personal perspective, and although I'm not a big reader of kind of leadership books and things, I'm consciously looking for. I use I don't use LinkedIn very much actually for kind of posting and for messaging and for keeping in contact with people, but I'm regularly looking on there, and I find some of the insights in there just fascinating, and I'm always looking for that next thing that's kind of going to stick with me for the rest of my career. So that's what drives my reading, I guess.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that. So it's interesting. So when we first created the training, we used for psychometric profiling, we started to use Myers-Briggs, and I do really like it. I think it's very good. However, what we learned quite quickly is the time for someone who is completely new to it to be able to learn, understand, and then apply that as a major incident manager and a lot of people just couldn't. There's too much complexity to it. What we found, that's why we moved. So we're a DISC partner with Wiley and Sons, which is, you may have come across that framework. It's still got enough. I mean, there's plenty of complexity in it and depth to it. It's very, very good, but it's got a surface level of knowledge that's very easy to acquire and actually apply. So we'll actually, through the training, once we teach people the initial frames of the 4 personality styles, we'll get them doing an exercise of, particularly with famous people, identifying what do you think they are. And obviously the ambition is that in real time they're able to use that and make reasonably good judgments about people's personalities very, very quickly, and then tailor their communication style based on that to the individual. So I'm a huge proponent of psychometric profiling for people in roles that really require them to engage with lots of diverse people. So that's brilliant that you guys are doing that. I think it's very powerful. It's just the levels of complexity in certain frameworks, I think, means that certain operational people.
And there's different levels to it, isn't it? I think even at that basic level of understanding yourself, that's quite enlightening. And I've seen some people react to, and I'm not talking about the sessions that we've been running most recently, but in a previous role, there were some people quite sceptical of going through the process, and to the point of being really quite negative about it, but coming out of the sessions saying, "Oh, that was really good. I've learned so much about myself." And I think it's just about learning about yourself and understanding the impact you have on others is the starting point. Once you then get to the point of understanding others and working out how you interact with them, that's a whole nother level, which I think that's a natural progression, isn't it? Maturity, as you start to understand those things more and more. And I'm by no means saying I'm an expert in terms of how I interact with other people, but I think what I like to think I've got is a good self-awareness of, who I am, what I am, and the impact that I have on other people.
Oh, yeah. I mean, for emotional intelligence, you almost can't move any further until you get to that point of self-awareness and having answer and self-regulation, like the behaviours that you manifest because of how you're feeling. But yeah, you almost can't get to social, relational, and others without first getting a good understanding of self. So I completely agree. A really underutilized thing, I think, in major incident management. What's interesting, you mentioned about people being skeptical. Even people who are very engaged and excited to come and do the training, we still see a real mixture of attitudes towards it before they do it. So even if you give them the complete backstory of actually this is from clinical psychology, it's been studied for many, many years, refined and improved, the accuracy rate's really, really high. It's not until people see their reports, and at this point we've trained thousands of people in all different countries, so very different cultural backgrounds too. And I'm yet to see a single person say to any of our trainers or myself that they completely disagree with any of it. It's always pretty spot on. And it's interesting how it manifests in both professional and personal life, though. I think people start thinking about their partners, whether they're married, wife, husband, whatever it may be. And so, yeah, I think it's people we all love hearing about ourselves and understanding self.
Well, I agree with you. I think you can't dispute it, can you? I remember attending a session. It wasn't that many years ago, actually, but it was a Myers-Briggs based thing, and it was a third party who was running it, and the person was giving the reports out. Here's your feedback from the questionnaires, etc. And looked at the form and said, Andrew, and I just put my hand up and took the form, and I read it, and I thought, I don't believe this. It's just, I don't know, whether I wasn't feeling myself when I answered the questionnaire, but I kept looking at it and thinking, this just doesn't sound like me at all. And and there's another guy looking at his in the same kind of quizzical way, and I just thought, I'm going to have to say something here in this forum of all of these people. So I said, I'm sorry, this just, I've done Myers-Briggs before. This is absolutely doesn't feel like me. And anyway, there were two Andrews in the room, and the questionnaires had got mixed up. So I had the other Andrews and he had mine. And once I got my one, it was me, and the other one was him. So, but yeah, there's just an example of where, once you see the feedback, you kind of know if, obviously you expect to get your own feedback, not somebody else's, but that's just an example of, I got somebody else's and I just thought this isn't me, and every time I've done it before, you think, yeah, I can't disagree with any of that.
Yeah, it's very interesting, very interesting. So couple of final questions. What's the biggest risk you've ever taken in your career?
I feel like I've taken a few risks in my career because I'm not somebody, everybody has kind of different career plans. Some people are very focused on a particular role or their manager's role or a particular role, the next level up in the organisation, whatever they see it being. I've never really targeted specific roles. I've kind of targeted particular things that I've wanted to do. And I think two examples. One, I joined a startup organisation, so I left a very, a good role in a good company. It was Energis at the time, and I joined a startup company, and that felt like a big leap because it was it was funded by venture capitalists. I'd only been there 7 weeks and I got made redundant. That was because the venture capitalist money got pulled. Subsequently, another VC came in and we kind of got refunded, so I kind of got re-employed, if you like. But that was you mentioned earlier about calculated risks and mitigating risk. One of the things I wanted to experience, because I'd really only worked for quite mature companies to that point in time. I wanted to experience a startup, and that was great. That was a massive learning curve for me because that was a 20-person company trying to make a go of something. And it had a team spirit like no other in my career, in that everybody was trying to make a success of this thing. And there were fairly regularly stand-up arguments in the office with a salesman that had sold something and a technical guy saying, well, we can't deliver that, we don't do that. Well, you're going to have to now because I've just sold it. But so although there were some, big confrontations, they were for the right reasons. So that felt like a big risk. And then I think, leaving Vodafone and joining O2 was a big risk. the role. The reason I made that decision to move was I wanted a role that was visible. I wanted a kind of highly focused, visible role. A major incident in most organisations is that, and certainly inside O2, it is that. So, it's given me a role that, most senior people in the organisation care about, and it's my role, and I care about it, and I want to make a success of it. So, but that was a risk because I had a great job at Vodafone. But yeah, took that decision, as I say, 20 months ago now.
Well, it sounds like it was a good decision. You seem pretty happy with it. So that's great.
I'm feeling great about where I'm at the moment. And I don't want that to sound detrimental to Vodafone, because that was a great company, and I had a great role there as well. It's just we all make decisions at some points in our career, don't we, to do something slightly differently, and
it's the natural. I think that's the natural order of things. You have a long enough career. It's very rare nowadays. I appreciate it was, particularly before my time, where people would spend their entire career with one company. That's pretty rare now. So I think, it certainly doesn't mean there's any. I've worked for some incredible companies, but moved on for various reasons or new opportunities. I completely agree. It doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with the previous company. And it's nice as well, though, because you look back at some of those companies, particularly the people that make those companies, and you look back with some really fond memories. So no, I understand that. So Andrew, thank you ever so much for your time. I've really enjoyed talking with you. I know the community will get a lot of value from hearing your thoughts, hearing about the teams, the way you structure them. We did mention it throughout, but if anyone's interested, Andrew's talk, if you have not seen it yet, from the MIM Expo 2020 is on there. It's all about a switch over to proactive major incident management, so dedicating a proportion of the resources to focusing on improvement and really driving down major incident volumes very successfully, I might add, and how that came about and the structure of it. So thank you ever so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And I'll look forward to speaking with you again in the near future.
Thanks, Adam. Nice to speak to you too. Thank you.